A quiet night in downtown Nashville, Tennessee. The kind of quiet where every little sound seems loud. Lieutenant Karen Dobbs sat in her patrol car, her gaze scanning West End Avenue. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, just watching. At least, that's what she told herself. Then she saw him. A tall black man in a dark suit, walking steadily down the sidewalk near an upscale fashion store. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't hesitating, he was just walking with confidence. And it made Karen uncomfortable. She turned on her headlights, rolled the patrol car forward, and stopped right next to him. She leaned out the window. "Do you live around here?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. The man turned, his eyes meeting hers. "Excuse me." His voice wasn't defensive, not hostile, just calm. And that made Karen even more unhappy. "You match the description of a suspect we're looking for." A slight crease appeared between the man's brows. "I'd like to know what that description is." Karen straightened her back. Dark suit. Tall. Walking in the area where a burglary had just occurred. The man sighed, slowly and carefully. "I see the suspicion. So what can I do to prove my innocence?" "You can start by showing us your ID." The man hesitated, not because he didn't have it, but because he knew exactly where this was going. But he quietly pulled out his wallet, took out his ID, and handed it to her. Karen took it, her eyes scanning the name on the card, and a cold chill ran down her spine. That name. It couldn't be. It couldn't be him. She looked back at the man's face in horror, her lips trembling slightly. The man standing before her was no stranger. He was Judge Quinton Marshall, a newly appointed federal court judge known for his sharp arguments about civil rights and justice. And now, she realized she had just harassed a black judge on the street, simply because of the color of his skin. Karen paled. Karen took a step forward, her gaze locked on the man in front of her. "Hands where I can see them." Her voice was firm, unwavering. He let out a breath, a long, frustrated sigh. "Now officer, this is an unnecessary turn." Karen noticed the tension in his shoulders, but not the kind of tension of someone about to cause trouble. It was restraint. An old reflex. A habit that was ingrained in his body. "Are you arresting me?" he asked, turning slowly, carefully, as if he had been through this before. She cuffed him. A neat snap. A familiar procedure. And just like that, it was done. But something felt wrong. There was no argument, no yelling. No threat of a lawsuit or a plea of innocence. Just silent compliance. As if he knew what was coming. As if this were just the beginning. The hum of voices in the Davidson County Courthouse filled the air as Lieutenant Karen Dobbs straightened her uniform, rolling her shoulders back. She had stood before the judge many times before. Another report. Another open and shut case. Another suspect. Except not this time. Across the room, Terrence Lawson sat at the defense table. He was unmoving, showing nothing but composure. His hands were neatly placed in front of him, his eyes calm. Not like someone on trial. It made her uncomfortable. Karen kept her face neutral as the prosecutor approached. A middle-aged man with thinning hair and a crisp navy suit, he nodded politely at her before beginning. "Lieutenant Dobbs, can you tell us about the night of your arrest?" She cleared her throat. "I was patrolling around 10:30 p.m. I noticed the defendant acting suspiciously near some of the businesses that had reported break-ins recently." The prosecutor nodded. "And what led you to arrest him?" His behavior indicated he was surveying the area. Walking slowly, stopping in front of a closed store. "I approached him, asked for his ID, but he refused." Terrence did not react. No resistance, no blink. His eyes only followed the defense attorney, a sharp-looking woman in her late 40s. And then she chuckled. Lieutenant Dobbs, Her voice was soft but as sharp as a knife. Do you know who my client is? Karen frowned. I don't understand your question. My client, the defense attorney said slowly, emphasizing each word, is an investigative journalist. He was doing a story about police misconduct in the area. And on the night you arrested him, he had vital evidence of massive corruption. The air in the courtroom suddenly became quiet. Karen's throat went dry. She turned to look at Terence, but this time, he looked straight at her. Only then did she realize he was right. And she was about to find out. Lieutenant Dobbs cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the file in front of him before slowly closing it. Are you familiar with the Fourth Amendment? Karen felt a shiver of tension run down her spine, up her neck, but she forced herself to keep her voice calm. Of course. Dobbs nodded, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose and continuing. So you understand that an officer needs reasonable suspicion to arrest someone. Can you point out what Mr. Lawson did that made him a suspect? Karen took a deep breath, clenching her hands in her lap to steady herself. As I said, he was loitering around a high-end shopping area late at night. The defense attorney, Victoria Hayes, raised her eyebrows slightly, the corners of her lips twitching as if she had heard this too many times. Loitering? Are you saying walking is a crime? Karen exhaled slowly, trying not to let her impatience show on her face. That depends on the circumstances. Victoria nodded, looking thoughtful. Right. So let's clarify those circumstances. Did you witness Mr. Lawson attempting to break into any closed businesses? No. Did he run away? Did he display any behavior that suggested criminal intent? Karen hesitated, her eyes flickering to Lieutenant Dobbs. No. Victoria stepped forward slowly, letting the silence stretch for a beat, as if to let the weight of the answer sink into every corner of the room. Then she tilted her head, asking slowly, sharply. How many people were walking down that street that night? Karen blinked. I don't have an exact number. Did you stop all of them? The air in the courtroom fell silent for a moment. Karen could feel the eyes on her. She swallowed. No, just him. The change in the room was almost tangible, a subtle realization Karen couldn't deny. She gripped the edge of the witness stand, a feeling that she couldn't name. Victoria didn't rush to attack. She glanced at Terence briefly, as if to confirm something, then turned back to the judge. No more questions, sir. Karen swallowed, feeling as if she'd stumbled into an invisible abyss. This wasn't going the way she'd expected. And something in Victoria's tone told her it wasn't over. It was just beginning. Karen sat motionless in the witness chair, her palms sweating against her thighs. She'd been in court before, but never like this. Victoria Hayes adjusted her glasses silently, walking slowly back to her desk. She opened the file with an unflinching calm, then looked up at Lieutenant Dobbs. So, let's talk about what happened after you arrested Mr. Lawson. Did you arrest him without incident? Karen nodded, agreeing. And then, she took him to the police station. Yes. Victoria walked slowly toward the defense table, picking up a document, her voice calm but weighty. According to your report, you charged him with obstruction of justice and resisting arrest. She raised her head, her eyes sharp on Karen. But you just testified that he complied. How exactly did he resist? Karen's mouth went dry. She remembered that moment, the tension in the air, the man's eyes as he looked at her, no defiance, just surprise and fear. He refused to produce identification. Victoria raised an eyebrow. Is that a crime? Karen hesitated. Could it be, if an individual was suspected of illegal activity? Suspicion based on what? Victoria's voice dropped, but the edge of her words didn't lessen. Karen clenched her jaw. His behavior. Victoria sighed, setting the papers down on the table. You keep saying that, Lieutenant. But consider the facts. You had no description of the suspect that matched him. You didn't see him commit a crime. You didn't even witness anything close to illegal behavior. And yet you arrested him. The words rang out in the courtroom, hanging for a second before Victoria continued. Did you ever stop to consider that he might just be a man walking home? Karen felt heat rising in her chest. She clenched her fists, trying to keep her composure. I did what any officer would do in my position. Victoria didn't blink. Would you have done the same, if he were white? A ripple rippled through the courtroom. Someone coughed, a small sound that echoed in the tense silence. The judge glanced at her warningly, but the atmosphere had grown heavier. Karen forced herself to keep her face neutral. Race has nothing to do with it. Victoria nodded, as if she had anticipated the answer. Let's move on. You ran his name through the system after he was arrested, right? Karen took a deep breath. Yes. Victoria held up another piece of paper. Did you find anything? Karen exhaled, shaking her head. No. No warrant. No conviction. Nothing. Victoria was silent for a few seconds, then stepped closer. Her voice was low, but each word hit home with undeniable reality. So to summarize, an innocent man, with no criminal record, who had broken no laws, was arrested. Silence filled the room. Karen felt her throat tighten, but she couldn't say anything more. All eyes were on her, waiting for an excuse. But she knew that no words could erase the truth. Karen clenched her teeth. She couldn't let the confusion get the better of her now. I stand by my decision. Victoria didn't argue. She just turned to the jury, her eyes cold and unwavering. That's all, Your Honor. The judge called for a recess. Karen sighed, stood up, straightened her uniform, and headed for the hallway. She needed a few minutes to compose herself. But as soon as she stepped outside, she saw something that made her stomach clench. Across the hallway, Terence Lawson was shaking hands with a court officer. The officer then leaned over and whispered something to Victoria. Karen froze. Her pulse quickened. Unease rose in her stomach. What was going on? Her fingers tightened in her lap as Lawson stood, adjusting his cuffs with suspicious confidence. The courtroom seemed to fall silent for a moment. Not just the way he moved, but the way he carried himself, as if he didn't need to fight to defend himself. As if he had already won. The judge looked up from his clipboard, his expression unreadable. Mr. Lawson, you may proceed. Karen stiffened. Since when were defendants allowed to proceed? Terence stepped forward, his voice steady, without a hint of tension. Your Honor, I have been silent throughout most of this proceeding, letting my attorney present his case. But I believe it is time for me to speak for myself. Karen's stomach clenched. He was too calm. Too in control. Go ahead, the judge said. Terence looked straight at her, his eyes sharp. Lieutenant Dobbs, he said slowly. Do you remember the night I was arrested? Karen's mouth went dry. But she nodded. Of course. And you swore under oath that you stopped me because I looked suspicious. Because I was hanging around a wealthy area. Because you thought you were acting in the public interest. Karen sat up straight. She didn't like the way he was leading this. That's right. A smile flickered across Terence's lips, not rushed, not ostentatious. Just a small hint that he knew something she didn't. Karen felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't good. Karen clenched her jaw, a chill running down her spine. Everything was falling apart too fast. Terence turned, his eyes never leaving the judge. He took a deep breath, his voice steady. Your Honor, I would like to formally introduce myself. The room froze. A silence fell over the courtroom, heavy and suffocating. My name is Special Agent Terence Lawson. Karen's heart stopped. I am a federal investigator with the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. For the past 7 months, I have worked undercover to identify patterns of unlawful policing, with a particular focus on racial profiling and false arrests. Karen's breath caught in her throat. She barely registered the whispers that rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor turned to her, his sharp gaze piercing her thoughts. Terrence pulled a badge from his jacket, the metal glinting in the light. He held it high, his voice low and sharp. This case has never been about me as a suspect. It has always been about me as a target. Everything around Karen shuddered. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't be. The judge nodded slowly, his voice full of authority. I have reviewed the documents provided by Mr. Lawson's team. It appears that this arrest is not only unjustified, but part of a systematic pattern of misconduct. She turned to Karen. Lieutenant Dobbs, do you have anything to say in your defense? Karen's throat went dry. The excuses suddenly felt meaningless. Everything she had believed in, her authority, her control in this courtroom, had crumbled. The defense attorney folded his arms across his chest, his voice firm. We will file a motion to dismiss the charges, effective immediately. The judge nodded. Motion granted. Karen couldn't quite grasp what was happening as the gavel rang out. But she knew the worst was yet to come. Because Terrence Lawson hadn't stopped. He took a step toward her, his eyes never leaving her pale face. Then he said, calmly, slowly, but with weight. Now, handcuff her. The murmur rose to a storm in the courtroom, but Karen could hear nothing but the pounding of her heart. The air was sucked out. She hadn't just wrongly arrested an innocent man. She had arrested a federal agent. And worse, an agent who investigated people like her. Terrence was still standing there. His badge was still in his hand, but his eyes did not leave hers. It was Lieutenant Dobbs now. His voice was soft, careful, but deep down, there was something like disappointment. Do you want to know why I was in that neighborhood? Karen swallowed, her throat scratched by sandpaper. But Terrence did not wait for an answer. I was there to follow up on a lead about police corruption. The words fell into the air, heavy as a sentence. He let them sink in, letting her feel their full meaning, before continuing. We've received a complaint about an officer in this district. He looked at her, his eyes searching, colder than before. Regarding an illegal stop, racial profiling. Karen felt her pulse pounding in her ears, each beat like a hammer. She knew exactly who the officer was he was talking about. So I went out alone that night. No wires, no backup. Just me. Terrence tilted his head, as if gauging her reaction. To see if the stories were true. Karen could barely breathe. The facts were coming out, indisputable. Terrence turned to the judge. And just minutes after I arrived, I was stopped and detained for no reason. He turned back to her, and this time, his gaze was as sharp as a knife. The truth weighed heavily on her. This had never been a routine arrest. She had walked straight into a trap, without even knowing it. The judge sighed. Agent Lawson, what has been presented here is extremely serious. I assume the Justice Department will take appropriate action. Karen clenched her hands into fists under the table. Terrence nodded, slowly but firmly. Sir, the Justice Department will conduct a full review of all of Lieutenant Dobbs's cases, as well as how the department handles civilian interactions. Karen's breath caught. A full review. What did that mean? Every traffic stop, every arrest, every report she had ever written, it would all be reviewed. Torn to pieces. She gritted her teeth. This wasn't fair. She was just doing her job. The judge nodded solemnly. This court will cooperate with any federal investigation as necessary. Terrence finally sat down, but the tension in the air had not lessened. Karen felt her head spinning. She hadn't realized she was gasping for air, as if the air had been sucked out of her. She wanted to say something, to protest, to deny. But all she could do was clench her fists, feeling everything she had ever believed in crumble before her eyes. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She was a cop. He'd been a wanted man. But today, the badge on her chest didn't symbolize power, it was a reminder. A watchdog. And soon, it might not be hers at all. But the worst part was, she wasn't sure she could argue with that. That she didn't deserve what was coming. Karen's hands were clammy, clenched on the polished wood of the table. The courtroom was so quiet she could hear her own breathing. But the silence didn't ease the heaviness in her chest. Things had changed, or maybe they had always been, she just never realized it. She trusted her authority. The system, her instincts. That she could recognize evil, that she could justify every decision she made, in the name of justice, in the name of safety. But today, she was the one on trial. The judge glanced at her one last time before standing. Adjournment. The gavel came down, a sharp sound that cut through the thick air. Karen didn't move. For the first time in her career, she didn't know where she stood. The courtroom was slowly emptying. But Terence Lawson was still sitting there. Watching her. Not angry. Not satisfied. But, something else. Disappointment. More painful than anything else. When he stood, he gently tucked his DOJ badge back into his jacket and buttoned it up. It didn't have to end like this, Lieutenant. Karen swallowed. She didn't know what to say. Terence shook his head. You don't even realize what you did. His voice was low, each word a knife to the flesh. Did you scare her? I did my job. He sighed. It was an exhausted sound. No, you did what you thought you could get away with. Karen's jaw tightened. How many others? Terence asked. She froze. How many others have you done this to? Her mouth opened and closed. There was no answer. And the silence was an answer clear enough. Terence looked at her for a long moment. His eyes scanned her features, as if searching for something, an explanation, a flash of remorse, or even a hint of sincerity. But in the end, he just shook his head, his shoulders slumped, and turned to walk toward the exit. The security guards followed him, silently but not without their eyes. The judge disappeared into the conference room, the dark wooden door slamming shut like a full stop. Even the prosecutor, who had patiently sat beside Karen throughout the trial, quickly gathered up his documents, stuffed them into a briefcase, and left without a word. Karen stood there, alone in the large room that had echoed with accusations and defenses. She sighed, slowly, as if she were trying to suppress something deep inside. Finally, she pushed herself up from the cold chair, her legs shaking as she walked toward the door. But as she passed the large glass, she stopped. Her reflection was clear, but so unfamiliar that it took her breath away. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure she recognized the woman looking back at her. Those eyes, once bright with confidence and power, now reflected only exhaustion and emptiness. All these years, she believed she could control everything, that she had the right to decide who belonged and who didn't. But now, as everything fell apart, she realized a terrifying truth: she had never really been in control. She was afraid. Because for the first time, she understood how others had always seen her. Not as a hero, not as a protector, but as a problem. As a barrier. As someone who had enabled the wrongs she had thought she was above. And worst of all, she had no one to blame but herself. Don't be like her. Power is not a shield against accountability. If you remain silent in the face of injustice, you are part of the problem. Speak up. Pay attention. And never assume that authority equals rightness. If this story has you thinking, perhaps it is time to take a look at yourself.